The sun was a white-hot hammer striking the anvil of the Pecos Valley. Dust hung in the air like a powdered curse, coating the throat and turning the taste of the world into grit. Billy sat on the porch of a collapsing shack, his thumb tracing the rough, splintered wood of a porch post. The smell of burnt coffee, thin and bitter, wafted from the doorway where Mrs. Higgins stood. She held a piece of paper, the ink fading under the relentless glare of the New Mexico sun. It was a legal notice, a scrap of paper that represented the law's cold indifference to the sweat of the poor. The sheriff had signed it, but the greed of the cattle barons had written it. Mrs. Higgins's hands were red and cracked, the texture of her skin like dried riverbeds. "They say I don't own the water rights no more, William," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Billy stood up, his spurs giving a faint, rhythmic jingle against the sun-baked boards. He looked at the dry irrigation ditch, where a single, stubborn desert willow was trying to grow against the odds. It was a fragile thing, much like the woman's hope. He noticed the way her eyes darted toward the horizon, fearing the dust cloud of a coming posse. "The law's a funny thing, ma'am," Billy said, his voice low and rhythmic. "It only seems to remember the folks who can pay for the memory." She couldn't. She couldn't pay the tax, and she couldn't fight the men in tin stars. Billy reached out and touched the iron lock on her front door, a heavy, rusted object that was supposed to represent autonomy, but now felt like a trap. The border between being a citizen and a ghost was as thin as that fence line. "Is the world always going to be this hard?" she asked. Billy looked at the horizon, where the heat waves distorted the mountains into shimmering ghosts. He adjusted his Stetson, the felt stiff with salt and age. He thought of the life he led, a cycle of lead and flight. He looked her in the eye with a gaze that wasn't of a killer, but of a tired brother. "Only if you want it to be," he replied softly. The sound of galloping horses broke the silence. The sheriff was coming to claim what the law had forgotten to protect. Billy didn't mount his horse to run. He checked the cylinder of his Colt 45, the click-slide a lethal prayer. The episode ended as the dust cloud at the edge of the property grew larger, devouring the sun. The dust settled slowly, coating the parched earth in a fresh layer of grey misery that tasted of iron and ancient heat. The sheriff reined in his mount just yards from the porch, the animal's flanks heaving with a rhythmic huff-huff that broke the suffocating stillness of the afternoon. He noticed the way the sheriff's hand hovered with practiced arrogance over his holster, the leather of his rig creaking like a gallows rope in a high wind. The scent of unwashed wool and horse sweat began to overpower the faint, lingering aroma of Mrs. Higgins' burnt coffee, creating a sensory border between the sanctity of the home and the encroaching invasion. Billy remained in the shadows of the eaves, the cold metal of the Colt 45 heavy and honest in his hand, a stark contrast to the flimsy, deceitful paper the lawman now clutched like a weapon. She couldn't find the words to protest, her throat as dry as the irrigation ditches that had been bled white by the cattle baron's greed. Behind the cracked shutters of the neighboring shacks, the forgotten people of the valley peered through the gloom, their faces mere blurs of desperation in the cooling air. They watched with a mixture of terror and a forbidden flicker of hope, seeing the notorious outlaw stand as a singular, lean silhouette against the dying light of the afternoon. The atmosphere was a powder keg, the temperature dropping as the desert prepared for its nightly freeze. Yet the air around the porch felt hot enough to ignite the very timbers of the house. Every sensory detail, the grit in Billy's teeth, the sharp cry of a distant hawk, and the absolute terrifying silence of the sheriff's men pointed toward a reckoning that no courthouse could ever contain. The sheriff stepped forward, his badge catching a stray, defiant glint of the sun that had refused to be entirely devoured by the dust. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the dry willow sapling Billy had been watching earlier, a casual act of cruelty that seemed to seal the fate of the property and the woman standing within it. Billy stepped out from the shade, the spurs on his boots singing a soft, lethal melody that made the deputies shift uncomfortably in their saddles. He looked at the legal notice, then at the woman whose life was being erased by a stroke of a pen, and finally at the man who claimed to represent the peace. "Only if you want it to be," Billy whispered, the words a cold echo of his earlier promise, as he leveled a gaze at the sheriff that held more weight than any judge's gavel. The iron lock on the door behind him stood as a silent witness to a man who had decided that when the law forgot its people, the people had no choice but to remember their own strength. The dust settled slowly, coating the parched earth in a fresh layer of grey misery that tasted of iron and ancient heat. The sheriff reined in his mount just yards from the porch, the animal's flanks heaving with a rhythmic huff-huff that broke the suffocating stillness of the afternoon. He noticed the way the sheriff's hand hovered with practiced arrogance over his holster, the leather of his rig creaking like a gallows rope in a high wind. The scent of unwashed wool and horse sweat began to overpower the faint, lingering aroma of Mrs. Higgins' burnt coffee, creating a sensory border between the sanctity of the home and the encroaching invasion. Billy remained in the shadows of the eaves, the cold metal of the Colt, .45 heavy and honest in his hand, a stark contrast to the flimsy, deceitful paper the lawman now clutched like a weapon. She couldn't find the words to protest, her throat as dry as the irrigation ditches that had been bled white by the cattle baron's greed. Behind the cracked shutters of the neighboring shacks, the forgotten people of the valley peered through the gloom, their faces mere blurs of desperation in the cooling air. They watched with a mixture of terror and a forbidden flicker of hope, seeing the notorious outlaw stand as a singular, lean silhouette against the dying light of the afternoon. The atmosphere was a powder keg, the temperature dropping as the desert prepared for its nightly freeze, yet the air around the porch felt hot enough to ignite the very timbers of the house. Every sensory detail, the grit in Billy's teeth, the sharp cry of a distant hawk, and the absolute terrifying silence of the sheriff's men, pointed toward a reckoning that no courthouse could ever contain. The sheriff stepped forward, his badge catching a stray, defiant glint of the sun that had refused to be entirely devoured by the dust. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the dry willow sapling Billy had been watching earlier, a casual act of cruelty that seemed to seal the fate of the property and the woman standing within it. Billy stepped out from the shade, the spurs on his boots singing a soft, lethal melody that made the deputies shift uncomfortably in their saddles. He looked at the legal notice, then at the woman whose life was being erased by a stroke of a pen, and finally at the man who claimed to represent the peace. "Only if you want it to be," Billy whispered, the words a cold echo of his earlier promise, as he leveled a gaze at the sheriff that held more weight than any judge's gavel. The iron lock on the door behind him stood as a silent witness to a man who had decided that when the law forgot its people, the people had no choice but to remember their own strength. The desert was a cathedral of silence, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind through the sagebrush. Billy rode deep into the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the scent of crushed juniper and horse sweat clinging to his clothes. He was being followed not by the law, but by the spirits of the land. A group of Apache warriors appeared on the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the blood-red sky. They didn't move. They simply existed as part of the rock and heat. Billy stopped his horse and raised his hands, palms open. He didn't reach for his Winchester. He felt the coarse friction of his leather reins against his calloused palms. "I seek the counsel of the Red Earth," Billy called out in their tongue, a language he had learned in the quiet spaces of his life. The warriors brought him to the camp of Chief Iron Sky. The smell of cedar smoke and roasting venison filled the air, a warmth that countered the biting cold of the mountain night. The chief sat by a fire that crackled like snapping bone. He looked at Billy, seeing the wanted posters in his mind, but also the man standing before him. "The white man's law is a fence," the chief said, his voice deep and resonant. "It tries to catch the wind. You are the wind, little brother, but even the wind must know where it blows." To prove his heart, Billy was tasked with the test of the silent stream. He had to wait by a trickle of water for a full night, protecting a small sapling from the nocturnal predators without firing a single shot. The cold was a physical weight, a frost that seeped into his marrow. They watched. The warriors watched from the darkness, as Billy used only his presence and a low, soothing hum to keep the mountain lions at bay. He noticed the way the sapling's leaves curled in the frost. He took off his own wool coat and draped it over the tiny plant, shivering in his thin shirt. It was an act of survival for a thing that couldn't protect itself. When dawn broke, the chief approached, seeing the young outlaw pale and trembling with cold, but the tree unharmed. "You defend the small things," the chief nodded, handing Billy a pouch of sacred cornmeal. "That is the only law that survives the fire." The chief gave Billy a piece of ancient turquoise, a symbol of the land's autonomy. It was a weight in his pocket, a reminder that the desert didn't care about bounties. As Billy rode back toward the valley, the Apache vanished back into the stone, leaving him alone with a new, heavy purpose. The law had failed the people, but the land had tested the man. The descent from the jagged, pine-scented altitudes of the Apache Heights was a slow crawl back into the shimmering, sulphurous heat of the valley floor, where the air tasted of alkali and old regrets. Billy felt the turquoise stone rubbing against his thigh through the rough, salt-stained denim of his trousers, a cool physical counterpoint to the sun that beat down like a blacksmith's hammer on a stubborn piece of iron. The pristine silence of the mountains was gradually replaced by the thick, choking scent of sun-baked dust and the distant, acrid smell of burning mesquite from the encroaching settlements. He noticed how the dry sagebrush rattled like a rattlesnake's warning in the parched wind, a sound that reminded him that the desert offered no mercy to those who sought to tame it with paper deeds and tin stars. His hands, calloused and mapped with the scars of 1,000 narrow escapes, gripped the leather reins with a new, steady resolve that transcended the simple, animal need for flight. As the jagged outlines of Lincoln's main street materialized through the shimmering heat haze, the atmosphere shifted from the wild autonomy of the wilderness to the suffocating tension of a town held hostage by its own protectors. The smell of horse manure and stale, cheap whiskey spilled from the swinging doors of the saloons, mixing with the heavy metallic ozone of a summer storm that gathered on the horizon but refused to break. They watched, the hollow-eyed pioneers, the weary laundresses, and the blacksmith with arms like knotted oak, from behind their splintered fences and boarded windows, their faces etched with the exhaustion of people who had been forgotten by the very law they were told to trust. Billy saw the sheriff's deputies patrolling the boardwalks with a discordant, arrogant rhythm of spurs that seemed to mock the desperate silence of the hungry and the displaced. To the men with the badges, the West was merely a ledger to be balanced in blood and stolen acreage. But to the young man riding in, it was a living spirit that the law had failed to protect. He reined in his horse at the edge of the Miller property, where the fence line stood like a jagged, rusted scar across the golden prairie, marking the boundary between a woman's life and the sheriff's insatiable greed. The charred remains of the farmhouse stood as a silent witness to the night the law turned into a torch, the blackened timber still smelling faintly of lavender and cold ash when the wind shifted toward the ridge. She couldn't fight the fire that consumed her history, and the courts in Santa Fe wouldn't hear the cries of a widow whose only crime was kindness to a stranger. Billy reached down to touch the cold, unyielding iron of the gate's latch, a symbol of the autonomy that had been stripped away under the guise of an official order. He thought of the Apache chief's words about the wind and the roots, and a grim, cold smile touched his lips as he realized that some injustices could only be settled in the dirt. "Only if you want it to be," he whispered into the rising wind, the phrase serving as both a tender memory of a lost home and an ironclad vow for the reckoning that was about to begin. Lincoln was a town built on secrets and shadows. The air inside the Broken Spur saloon was thick with the smell of cheap rye, stale tobacco, and the metallic ozone of fear. Billy walked in, the swing doors creaking a warning. The piano player stopped mid-note, the silence following like a shroud. The sheriff sat at a table in the center, surrounded by his deputies, men who wore badges but carried the hearts of vultures. They were celebrating the latest land grab, a stack of deeds sitting on the table like a pile of stolen lives. The texture of the paper was smooth and expensive, a contrast to the rough, calloused hands of the people who had lost them. "You're a long way from the hole you crawled out of, kid," the sheriff sneered, his hand hovering over his Smith & Wesson. Billy didn't go for his gun. He walked to the bar and ordered a coffee, the heat of the mug warming his fingers. He noticed the barman's shaking hands and the way the patrons huddled in the corners like cattle in a storm. These were the people the law forgot, the blacksmith, the laundress, the dirt farmers. "I reckon these papers don't belong to you, Sheriff," Billy said, his voice cutting through the tension. "A man's land is his soul. You can't trade souls for whiskey." "The law says otherwise," the sheriff laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Then the law is a liar," Billy replied. The tension was a physical pressure, a heat that made the sweat roll down the backs of everyone in the room. Billy pulled out the turquoise stone and set it on the bar. It glowed under the flickering oil lamps, a piece of the mountain in a den of thieves. They watched as Billy reached into his vest and pulled out the small brass key he had taken from a corrupt clerk earlier. "I'm opening a new door tonight," Billy whispered. Suddenly, the doors burst open. It wasn't more outlaws. It was the people, the widows, the farmers, and the forgotten, led by Chavez. They didn't have guns. They had the truth of their presence. Billy had spent the week gathering them, showing them that the law only had power if they agreed to be afraid. The cliffhanger saw the sheriff standing, outdrawn not by a gun, but by a community, as Billy smiled a razor-thin smile. The sheriff's face went the color of curdled milk as the humid night air rushed into the room, carrying the scent of rain and wet horsehair that cut through the saloon's stale haze of tobacco. His hand hovered over his holster, fingers twitching like a dying bird, but the sheer weight of a dozen silent, accusatory gazes pinned him to his chair more effectively than any shackle. They watched. The blacksmith, with arms like knotted oak, and the laundress, whose hands were permanently bleached and scarred by lie, stood as a human wall against the corruption that had bled them dry for years. The rhythmic thump-thump of a loose floorboard under Chavez's boot was the only sound in the room, a heartbeat of rebellion that echoed against the rows of overpriced whiskey bottles and the cold, unyielding glint of the sheriff's tarnished star. Billy stepped forward, the spurs on his heels singing a low, lethal melody that seemed to mock the sheriff's frozen authority in the flickering lamplight. He noticed the way the lawman's eyes darted toward the back door, searching for an escape that didn't involve facing the people he had systematically discarded. Billy reached out and snatched the stack of deeds from the table, the paper feeling thin and fragile in his calloused grip. A symbol of autonomy that had been stolen under the guise of legal jargon and intimidation. To the people standing in the doorway, those scraps of parchment were the difference between a warm hearth and a life spent wandering the sagebrush. And Billy held them with a reverence that defied his reputation as a remorseless killer. The boundary between the hunter and the hunted had dissolved in that moment, leaving only a boy with a crooked smile and a town that had finally found its voice in the heavy, expectant silence. "You think a piece of tin makes you a king, Pat?" Billy's voice was a soft rasp, as calm as the desert before a flash flood, yet it carried the weight of every scorched acre and every forgotten promise. He tossed the root cellar key onto the pile of documents, the metallic clink sounding like a gavel, striking a final judgment against a system that had failed the very people it was sworn to protect. The sheriff looked at the faces of the widows and the farmers, people he had bullied into shadows, and realized the power he thought he possessed had vanished like smoke in a gale. Billy leaned in close, his eyes reflecting the cold blue of a mountain lake, and whispered the words that had become his own private gospel of the frontier. "Only if you want it to be," he said, turning his back on the guns of the law to lead the people out into the cooling night, toward the fence lines that would no longer hold their spirits captive. The final confrontation happened at the edge of the town, where the main street dissolved into the wild desert. The sun was setting, bleeding out over the horizon in shades of violet and gold. The sheriff and his men stood on one side of the fence, representing a law that had become a cage. Billy stood on the other, the frontier at his back. There was no grand speech. The wind hissed through the barbed wire, a sound like 1,000 whispers. Billy held the stack of deeds in one hand and his Colt in the other. He looked at the people of Lincoln standing behind him now, their faces etched with the hard reality of survival. "This land was never yours to take," Billy said to the sheriff. The sheriff went for his gun, but his movement was slow, hindered by the weight of his own corruption. Billy was faster, but he didn't shoot to kill. He shot the gun out of the sheriff's hand, the metallic ping of lead on steel echoing off the canyon walls. The sheriff fell back into the dirt, his badge flying off into the dust. She couldn't. Mrs. Higgins stood at the front of the crowd, watching as Billy handed her back the deed to her farm. Her hands trembled as she touched the paper. Billy then turned to the irrigation gate, the physical border that controlled the lifeblood of the valley. With one shot, he shattered the padlock that the cattle barons had installed. "Water's for everyone now," Billy announced. The townspeople didn't cheer. They simply began to move. They walked past the sheriff as if he were a ghost, heading toward the water. The power had shifted. Justice hadn't come from a judge's gavel, but from the refusal to be forgotten. Billy mounted his horse, looking back at the town one last time. The chief's turquoise stone was left on the irrigation gate, a silent guardian. Billy felt the cool night air begin to rise, the scent of lavender from the distant hills filling his lungs. He looked at the sapling he had protected in the mountains. In his mind, he saw it growing into a great tree, a landmark for those who were lost. The rough grain of the leather pommel felt icy against his calloused palms as he adjusted his weight, the rhythmic huff of his mare's breath creating small, fleeting clouds of mist in the sharp evening air. He noticed the way the dust settled on the sheriff's discarded badge, a piece of tarnished tin that no longer held the power to terrify or command. The scent of lavender, carried on a breeze that felt like the earth's own sigh of relief, began to wash away the acrid, lingering stench of the saloon's stale whiskey and the metallic tang of fear. It was a moment of profound, heavy silence, where the only boundary left was the line between the man he was forced to be and the ghost he was destined to become. They watched from their porches and their broken fences, no longer as victims of a forgotten law, but as architects of their own survival. Mrs. Higgins walked with a spine that had finally straightened, her fingers clutching the deed with a grip that spoke of a hard-won autonomy that no judge could ever revoke. She couldn't have stood against the tide of the cattle barons alone, but in the wake of the kids' silent intervention, the very air seemed to have thickened with a collective, quiet defiance. The sheriff remained slumped in the dirt, a physical metaphor for a system that had failed its people, while the rhythmic clink-clink of the irrigation gate's release provided the only music for a town that had finally remembered how to breathe. Billy turned his horse toward the dark, jagged teeth of the mountains, the turquoise stone on the gate glowing like a blue eye in the fading light. He thought of the sapling, its roots stretching deep into the red earth, and realized that justice in this wild land was less like a hammer and more like a seed, fragile, slow to grow, and requiring protection from the biting frost of greed. As he reached the final cattle guard, he paused, the vast New Mexico sky unfolding above him like a map of endless, lonely choices. He remembered the look in the widow's eyes when he first arrived, a mirror of his own restless soul, and whispered the words that had become his only true creed. "Only if you want it to be," he murmured to the rising moon, before spurs bit into leather and he dissolved into the shadows, a legend returning to the desert that had birthed him. He rode toward the border, the silhouette of a man the world called a monster, but the people called a brother. He stopped his horse at the final fence line and looked at the moon, a silver coin in a velvet sky. The cycle of his life would continue, the posters, the chases, the narrow escapes, but for one night, the law hadn't failed. "Is it over, kid?" Chavez asked, riding up beside him. Billy looked at the stars, his face peaceful in the pale light. He thought of the girl with the bird, the widow with her land, and the tree in the frost. He knew the history books would tell a different story, but the truth was written in the dirt of the valley and the hearts of the poor. "Only if you want it to be," Billy whispered, and then he vanished into the dark, leaving only the sound of the wind and the smell of the wild, free earth.